What if I told you that way back in the 1970s, a bunch of scientists at MIT actually tried to build a computer model to project where we're headed? And some of their findings, well, they point to a pretty significant period around 2040.
Yeah, that's right, Andy. We're going way back on this Econverse deep dive back to the, kind of early days of using computer models to try and understand how economies and societies might evolve. Back in the 70s, this group at MIT was really grappling with a fundamental question. And, for a planet with limited resources, it's a pretty big one. Are there like natural limits to how much our society can actually grow? And they weren't just like theorizing, they actually built a computer model
Oh, wow.
to explore all of this.
Okay, so we've all heard predictions about, societal collapse, haven't we?
Right.
It feels like every other week there's a new one, and history is full of forecasts that just completely miss the mark.
Yeah.
So why should we care?
Well, that's a great question, Andy. I mean, particularly, for our Econverse listeners all over the world, why should they pay attention to a study from over 50 years ago,
That's
right?
exactly, yeah.
Well, what's so interesting about this particular model is that it wasn't based on, some vague feelings or prophecies or anything like that.
Right.
It was built on real data and tried to actually like simulate those really complex interactions between different global systems.
Okay.
And perhaps even more surprising is that research done decades later suggests that their projections might have been much more accurate than people originally thought.
So this 1970s crystal ball wasn't just, a bunch of guesswork.
No, not at all.
What kind of information did they actually use?
Well, the original study, which is known as Limits to Growth, focused on 5 key interconnected factors.
Okay.
So those were global population industrial output, how much we're producing, food production, natural resources.
Metals and fuels, and of course, pollution levels. Now, it's interesting, for us on Econverse, thinking back to the 70s, while there were environmental concerns, even then, climate change as we understand it today,
Yeah.
with all its complexities, it wasn't the main focus back then,
Right.
at least not in their model.
So they programmed all of this data into their computer, which I imagine back then was the size of a small room.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
What did it tell them?
Well, it's not like they came up with, just a single prediction.
Okay.
The researchers ran a whole bunch of different simulations, tweaking different elements each time to see a range of possible futures.
Okay.
One of the most central scenarios, though, was what they called business as usual.
Okay.
And this basically projected what would happen if global trends in population growth, resource use, and all of that continued on the same path with no real changes.
So business as usual, that doesn't sound particularly good, does it?
No, not really.
Like, was it a positive outlook?
In that scenario, their model showed continued growth for a while in industry food production population.
Okay.
But that very growth led to a rapid depletion of the planet's finite resources, things like metals, the fuels that power our economies.
Right.
And eventually, the scarcity of resources led to a sharp decline. You could even call it a collapse in industrial output.
Wow.
This, of course, had a domino effect.
Yep.
Food production also decreased because there wasn't enough fuel or electricity for modern agriculture.
Right.
The ultimate result, well, massive unemployment, widespread hunger, a huge drop in global population. Basically, societal collapse driven by running out of crucial resources.
So even without factoring in pollution, just running out of stuff
Exactly.
could derail us.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah, it is for sure.
And a really important insight from the business as usual scenario is that even without heavily considering pollution, finite resources alone, that could be enough to really throw our current trajectory off course.
But we humans are pretty resourceful, aren't we? Like, what if we just discovered, vast new reserves of these resources? Did they factor that in?
They did, Andy.
Okay.
In fact, in another scenario, they actually doubled the amount of estimated available resources.
Okay.
So yeah, they wanted to test whether just simply having more stuff, would actually prevent this collapse.
So more oil, more metals were good, right?
Well, not quite, Andy. While having twice the resources did slow down the depletion rate, the continued growth that it fueled led to a huge spike in pollution.
Oh.
And that became the real problem.
So that-
It damaged both human health and plant life, leading to widespread crop failures and famine.
Wow.
So once again, population collapsed this time due to hunger and pollution. And with a much smaller workforce, industrial output also tanked.
Oh.
So the model suggested that even with tons more resources, unchecked growth could still lead to collapse, just, triggered by a different problem.
Right. Okay, so it's not just about having enough stuff. It's about what that does to the environment.
Right.
Now, what about our, human ability to innovate? Like, can't we just invent our way out of this mess?
One scenario they looked at was called comprehensive technologies,
Okay.
which basically simulated a future with super high levels of technological innovation. Now, the initial runs of this model still projected a pretty significant collapse in both food and industrial output.
Okay.
But get this, in a later update they did around the year 2000, they refined this scenario. And it suggested that with truly groundbreaking advancements, across the board, we might actually see a period of, you know, overshoot and then collapse in industrial output and resource availability around the middle of the century, like
Okay.
2050.
But in this scenario, food production could recover somewhat due to those technological advancements.
Right, precisely.
So innovation offers a way out, but even then it sounds pretty rough.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
even the more optimistic tech-heavy scenario still pointed to major disruption.
Right.
It implied that we'd need constant groundbreaking innovations, almost a constant stream of, like you said, Elon Musk's to actually get us through.
I mean, that's a big gamble, right? Just hoping for constant miracles.
It is.
So were there any scenarios that they ran that looked more stable, less apocalyptic?
Yes, there was one called the stabilized world scenario. And this one was really interesting because it envisioned a complete shift in priorities. Instead of focusing on constant economic growth, the model shifted to overall social welfare and sustainability.
So in the context of, this global model, what does social welfare really mean?
Well, it involves several key things: stabilizing the global population, maintaining industrial output at a sustainable level,
No.
rather than, always striving for more and more, increasing food production to meet those needs, reducing pollution,
Right.
basically using resources at a rate that the planet could actually handle.
That sounds pretty ideal.
It does,
But
right?
I'm sure there were some caveats.
Well, the model indicated that to make this stabilized world scenario a reality, we would need a major shift in global governance.
What do you mean?
Well, it basically implied a move away from, those purely nationalistic, growth-obsessed policies that we see so much of,
Right.
towards more internationally cooperative approaches.
Okay.
Ones that prioritize social welfare and sustainability on a global scale.
Okay.
It would likely involve countries being willing to, give up some degree of their own sovereignty
I see.
and really adopt a new way of thinking about global priorities and the common good.
Okay, so that sounds like a monumental challenge in itself, just given, the nature of international relations.
Absolutely.
So those were the main scenarios from that 1972 study.
Yes.
What's happened since then?
Well, this is where the follow-up research gets really interesting.
Yeah.
In 2009, there was a study published in the journal American Scientist, and they revisited the original MIT model using data from the decades that had passed. And get this, they found that the real-world data aligned pretty closely with the model's projections.
Really?
Yeah, particularly with those, less optimistic business as usual scenarios.
Oh.
Then more recently, around 2021, a Dutch sustainability researcher named Gaia Harrington, who was working at KPMG, also decided to take a deep dive into this.
Okay, so what did Harrington find? Were those old predictions way off, or was there something more to it?
Well, Harrington's research was really important.
Okay.
She systematically compared all those different scenarios from the 72 model with the actual data that we have now.
Okay.
And her findings showed that the business as usual scenario, remember the one that predicted a potential halt in economic growth around 2030
Yeah.
and societal collapse around 2040?
Right.
Well, it's still the trajectory that seems to match up most closely with real world data.
Really?
Yeah, across a whole bunch of indicators. And she even pointed out that according to this track, we seem to be approaching what she calls peak welfare.
Peak welfare. So that suggests a turning point where things start to decline.
Yes, exactly.
Doesn't sound good.
And Harrington also emphasized something that the original MIT scientists had warned about back in the 70s. They said that we needed to take action then to avoid serious consequences. But that large-scale coordinated action, well, it didn't really happen. And now we're starting to see the impacts, especially when it comes to climate change, which just makes those resource depletion and pollution issues even worse.
So this model that people initially dismissed might actually be quite accurate.
It's pretty significant.
Uh,
But Harrington did offer some hope, right? It wasn't all doom and gloom. Even though we seem to be on a concerning path, she was very clear that societal collapse isn't inevitable.
Okay.
She said, we still have a choice to align with a scenario that does not end in collapse.
Okay. So there's still time to course correct.
Exactly. She believes that through innovation in business, effective government policies, and positive developments in, civil society, we can still shift onto a more sustainable path.
That makes sense.
She also highlighted the importance of regularly updating these types of models with the latest data
Right.
to get even more refined insights into the challenges and opportunities ahead.
Okay, so it's not predetermined, there's still agency.
Exactly.
Now, I remember reading that the initial MIT graphs might have predicted a collapse a bit earlier, like around the year 2000, and that the timeline was later shifted to 2040.
Yeah. There's definitely been some discussion and debate about the exact timelines presented in those different publications.
Right.
Some interpretations of those early graphs do suggest a potential downturn starting around the early 2000s.
Okay.
But later in a follow-up book they published, the timeline for a more significant collapse was often framed as being in the mid-21st century, which, is closer to that 2040 mark.
Okay.
This shift has been a point of contention for some critics of the model.
Okay, so the timeline isn't universally accepted.
Right.
What are some other criticisms of the limits to growth study?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms, and it's been around since the study was first published, is that it's just too pessimistic about human innovation.
Yep.
The argument is that as we face more challenges, we'll be forced to come up with solutions.
Right. Necessity breeds innovation.
Exactly. And those breakthroughs will help us overcome these limits.
Right. But haven't there been lots of doomsday predictions throughout history that just turned out to be wrong?
There have been plenty.
So should we take this one with a grain of salt, too?
It's true. History is full of failed doomsday predictions.
Right.
But the MIT model wasn't a prophecy about the end of the world.
Okay.
It presented different scenarios based on specific trends and assumptions. And while some past predictions have been totally inaccurate, the fact that follow-up studies have shown a good deal of alignment between the MIT model's long-term trends and real-world data, well, it gives it more weight.
I see.
It's something to consider.
What about the idea that the real problem might be population collapse,
Yeah.
like declining birth rates instead of overpopulation?
Yeah, that's a really important point, Andy. And some demographers are quite concerned about a potential demographic implosion later this century, which could bring its own set of challenges.
Right.
Aging populations, shrinking workforces.
Right.
It's a different kind of shift than the one predicted by the MIT model, which focused on the effects of continued population growth.
Okay.
It's also worth noting that since the original study, there's been progress in areas like reducing world hunger,
Yeah.
increasing infant survival rates, and raising global life expectancy.
Right.
So there have been positive developments too.
So taking all of this in, what are the key takeaways for our Econverse listeners?
Well, I think the MIT model, despite its flaws, offers a really valuable perspective on how everything is connected: population, resources, industry, food production, pollution.
Right.
It highlights the potential consequences of just continuing on this path of unchecked growth.
Right.
And the research suggests that in some key areas that business as usual scenario is playing out.
But it's not a guaranteed future.
Exactly. The study and the follow-up research also highlight the potential of technology and a global shift towards sustainability and social welfare.
Okay.
These could be ways to avoid or at least mitigate the worst outcomes.
Right. So it raises some fundamental questions about our priorities.
It does. Do we prioritize relentless economic growth, or do we focus on long-term well-being and sustainability?
Right.
And how do we cooperate on a global scale to address these interconnected challenges?
So just to recap, this 1970s MIT model gave us a few different scenarios.
Right.
Some predicting societal challenges around the middle of this century based on the idea that there are limits to growth on our planet.
Yes.
And follow-up research suggests we might be on a concerning path,
we might be.
but other pathways are still possible if we can use technology responsibly and shift our focus towards things like sustainability and social well-being.
Exactly. And one of the most crucial points from Gaia Harrington's more recent work is that the future isn't set in stone.
Right.
We still have the power to change course.
So here's a final thought for our Econverse listeners to ponder. Given all of these interconnected systems and the tension between individual nations and the need for global solutions, what single change do you think would have the biggest impact on moving us towards a more sustainable future?
It really makes you think about how interconnected our world really is.
It does.
And the long-term consequences of our actions.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into long-term economic and societal forecasting here on Econverse.
Thanks, everyone.